On the coldest winter morning in decades, a retired carpenter drove home with 650 loads of scrap wood that everyone else called worthless. They laughed, convinced he had just buried himself in someone else's trash. But hidden inside those forgotten piles was a secret that would expose years of corruption, save a struggling town, and build the most sought-after smoking wood brand in America. Sometimes, the greatest treasure isn't buried underground. It's hiding inside the things everyone else throws away. The Adirondack foothills outside Saranac Lake lay beneath the harshest winter in 30 years. Snow buried the roads, frozen wind swept through black spruce forests, and dawn arrived as a thin silver line behind the mountains. Nathan Cole first saw the abandoned timber yard through the windshield of his rust-stained pickup truck. Beyond a sagging chain-link fence, hundreds of enormous wooden bins stood beneath torn tarps, packed with sawdust, bark strips, splintered hardwood blocks, and crooked offcuts rejected by the machinery inside the silent mill. Snow had settled over them like burial cloth. Some piles rose higher than the loading docks. Others had collapsed into leaning walls of dark wood and frozen dust. A red county notice fastened to the gate announced that the entire site would soon be cleared and the waste transported to a landfill. Nathan switched off the engine but remained seated. At 62, he was still a large man, though the years had begun pulling his shoulders forward. He stood 6'1", with a wide chest, heavy forearms, and hands permanently marked by old cuts, burned scars, and pale lines left by chisels that had slipped decades ago. His face was long and sharply boned, framed by a coarse iron-gray beard that grew thicker along his square jaw. His dark brown eyes were steady but tired, the eyes of someone accustomed to examining grain patterns, fire temperatures, and human promises before trusting any of them. A faded wool cap covered most of his short gray hair, and he wore the same brown canvas coat he had patched so many times that the repairs had become part of its design. Nathan had once been one of the most respected Finnish carpenters in northern New York. He built staircases that curved without visible joints, restored century-old lake houses, and carved mantels that wealthy families displayed as if they were inherited treasures. On weekends, he smoked venison, brisket, and trout in a brick smokehouse behind his workshop. People used to drive from 3 counties away for his maple-smoked beef and cherrywood sausage. Then his wife, Claire, became ill. For 4 years, Nathan reduced his work until there was almost none left. He cared for her through hospital visits, exhausted nights, and months when neither of them spoke honestly about what was coming. Claire died 7 winters earlier. The medical bills consumed their savings. The workshop lost its customers. By the time Nathan tried to return, modern contractors had replaced hand-cut joinery with cheaper prefabricated materials. His name remained respected, but respect did not pay property taxes. He now lived alone on 14 wooded acres with a workshop that smelled more of dust than labor. He repaired chairs, sharpened tools, and occasionally smoked meat for local church events. He told people he preferred the quiet. The truth was more complicated. Quiet asked fewer questions. The mill had closed 3 months earlier after its owners declared bankruptcy and disappeared behind lawyers. More than 600 industrial bins and bundled loads of hardwood waste remained behind. County officials estimated that removal would cost nearly $80,000 because some of the material had absorbed moisture and been classified as contaminated commercial debris. Nathan had heard about it from a young cashier at a hardware store. "Whole mountain of rotten wood," the boy had said. "County's paying to bury it." Rotten wood. Nathan had repeated the phrase silently all the way home. Now he stepped from the pickup, boots sinking into deep snow. The cold struck his cheeks like open hands. He walked toward the nearest pile and pulled back a frozen section of tarp. Beneath it lay short chunks of sugar maple, black cherry, hickory, and applewood. Most were too small for furniture. Some were split. Others carried knots, bark, or uneven cuts that industrial saws could not use efficiently. Nathan lifted one piece of cherrywood and scraped its surface with his pocket knife. The wood beneath was dry, fragrant, and deep red. Not rotten. Rejected. There was a difference, and Nathan had spent his whole life understanding differences that machines ignored. A door opened inside the temporary county office beside the mill. A man named Wesley Pike emerged carrying a clipboard. Wesley was 55, thin and long-necked, with neatly parted blonde-gray hair and a narrow face that seemed permanently disappointed. His wire-framed glasses rested low on his nose, and his clean navy overcoat looked absurdly formal beside the ruined mill. He had worked in county property management for 20 years, a job that rewarded caution and punished imagination. People described him as polite, efficient, and entirely unwilling to risk his position for anything unusual. "You Nathan Cole?" Wesley called. Nathan nodded. "I was told you had questions about the debris. I want it." Wesley stopped walking. "All of it. All the hardwood." A short laugh escaped him before he could hide it. "Mr. Cole, there are hundreds of loads here. Some of those piles have been exposed for months. The county is arranging regulated disposal. Then I can save the county the disposal cost." Wesley studied Nathan as though searching for the joke. "You understand you would assume responsibility for transport, storage, fire prevention, runoff, and any complaints from neighboring properties?" "I understand, Wood. That isn't what I asked." "It is the answer." Two maintenance workers standing near a snowplow overheard them. One whispered something, and both men laughed. Nathan recognized the sound. He had heard it from contractors who said hand craftsmanship was finished, from bankers who said his workshop had no future, and from friends who told him to sell his land after Claire died. Only a desperate man, people believed, collected what the world had rejected. Nathan walked back to the uncovered pile and picked up the cherrywood again. He held it beneath his nose. Even in the freezing air, the scent remained faintly sweet. His father, Amos Cole, had been a quiet woodsman with a crooked nose, thick black beard, and the strange habit of talking to lumber before cutting it. Nathan had once asked why he saved bent boards, knotted branches, and damaged logs behind their barn. Amos had answered, "A tree spends 50 years becoming itself. Don't insult it because a machine wanted a straight piece." Nathan had not thought of those words in years. He turned toward Wesley. "Prepare the release." Wesley blinked. "You cannot possibly move this alone." Nathan looked across the enormous frozen yard, at the mountains of what everyone else had already sentenced to burial. For the first time since Claire's death, fear and purpose rose inside him together. That feeling frightened him more than the debt. It also made him feel alive. "No," Nathan said, a small smile appearing beneath his gray beard. "But I can begin alone." The following morning arrived with a sky as clear as polished glass. Overnight, the temperature had dropped even lower, covering every fence rail and pine branch with a thick layer of glittering frost. Smoke rose quietly from Nathan Cole's chimney, the first steady column of smoke his old workshop had produced in years. Nathan began before sunrise. Instead of hauling entire piles of discarded wood home, he established a simple sorting station inside the abandoned mill's loading yard after receiving temporary permission from Wesley Pike. He laid out 4 weathered pallets and marked them with chalk: maple, cherry, apple, and hickory. By mid-morning, his heavy leather gloves were coated with fine sawdust, while neat stacks slowly replaced the chaotic mountain everyone else had dismissed as garbage. The more Nathan examined each piece, the more convinced he became that the mill had not thrown away worthless timber. Most pieces were perfectly healthy hardwood. Some contained beautiful grain patterns hidden beneath rough bark. Others were simply too short, too narrow, or slightly twisted for automated furniture production. Industrial machines demanded uniform dimensions. Nature rarely provided them. Nathan smiled to himself. Machines measured inches. Craftsmen measured possibilities. Late that afternoon, the sound of tires crunching across frozen gravel interrupted his work. A dusty blue station wagon stopped beside the gate. A woman stepped out carrying a worn canvas satchel over one shoulder. She introduced herself as Lena Brooks. At 31, Lena stood about 5 feet 8 with a lean, athletic frame built from years of lifting lumber rather than exercising in a gym. Her chestnut brown hair was tied into a loose braid beneath a charcoal knit cap, while a few wind-blown strands framed a face marked by quiet determination instead of makeup. Her hazel eyes constantly scanned the yard, automatically identifying with species the way other people recognized familiar faces. She wore a faded flannel shirt beneath a thick green work jacket, insulated jeans, and scarred leather boots stained with resin from countless shifts inside the mill. Nathan recognized the confidence in the way she walked. "You worked here," he said. She nodded. "Warehouse supervisor." "For how long?" "9 years." Nathan looked around the silent yard. "I'm sorry." Lena gave a small shrug. The mill closed 3 months ago. Feeling sorry won't reopen it. Her voice carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. Losing the job had forced her to sell her small apartment and move back into her late grandmother's farmhouse outside Saranac Lake. She now worked temporary shifts unloading delivery trucks whenever anyone needed an extra pair of hands. She glanced toward Nathan's carefully organized stacks. "You've already separated the cherry from the maple." Nathan smiled. "I guessed." "You guessed well." She knelt beside one pile and picked up a rough block no longer than her forearm. "This isn't scrap," she said softly. "It's black cherry heartwood. The scanners rejected it because the knot sits too close to the edge." She picked up another. "Apple." Another. "White oak." Nathan watched in silence. For the first time since beginning this impossible project, he realized someone else could see the same hidden value he had seen on that first freezing morning. As the winter sun slipped behind the Adirondack peaks, the abandoned mill no longer looked like a graveyard. It looked like the beginning of a workshop waiting to breathe again. The next morning, Lena returned before sunrise carrying a small notebook whose pages had become soft from years of being tucked into her work jacket. She placed it carefully on an overturned crate beside Nathan without saying a word. Inside were hand-drawn maps of the mill's old storage system. Every section had been labeled in neat handwriting: hard maple, sugar maple, red oak, black cherry, applewood, hickory, and even small experimental batches the factory had once purchased from local orchards. "I started making these when the computer inventory kept making mistakes," she explained. "The software only cared about volume. I cared about where every board came from." Nathan slowly turned the pages, impressed by the patience behind every note. "You never stopped paying attention," he said quietly. Lena smiled for the first time. Someone had to. Together, they spent hours opening forgotten bundles buried beneath months of snow. Many contained beautiful hardwood that had never even reached the production line. A few stacks had been rejected simply because they arrived after purchase contracts had already been fulfilled. Others carried harmless knots or unusual grain patterns that expensive furniture companies considered defects, but artisans often prized. Every discovery strengthened Nathan's belief that modern factories had become so dependent on efficiency that they no longer recognized character. By early afternoon, Nathan loaded several carefully selected pieces of applewood and black cherry into the smoker behind his old workshop. The brick smokehouse had not been used seriously since Claire was alive. Ash still rested inside the firebox from the final meal they had shared together. Before striking the match, Nathan paused for several seconds, his hand resting on the weathered brick. For years he had avoided this place because every corner reminded him of laughter that no longer echoed there. Today the silence felt different. It no longer sounded empty. It sounded patient. Lena watched from a respectful distance as thin blue smoke slowly curled into the freezing Adirondack sky. Nathan arranged a single beef brisket inside the smoker with practiced precision, blending small pieces of applewood with black cherry instead of relying on one species alone. The fire burned slowly, producing a sweet aroma neither sharp nor bitter. "Wood speaks the same way people do," Nathan said while adjusting the vents. "Some voices are beautiful alone. Others become unforgettable only when they learn to work together." Hours later, the brisket emerged with a deep mahogany crust that shimmered beneath the warm workshop lights. Nathan sliced a single piece and handed it to Lena without saying a word. She accepted it politely, expecting good food. What she tasted stopped her completely. The gentle sweetness of applewood arrived first, followed by the richer fruit notes of black cherry and a clean finish unlike anything she remembered from commercial smokehouses. She closed her eyes as memories surfaced of family cookouts before the mill consumed every hour of her father's life. "I've spent 9 years surrounded by wood," she whispered, "and I never imagined discarded pieces could create something like this." Nathan looked toward the neatly organized stacks waiting outside the workshop doors. "People stopped asking what these trees wanted to become," he replied softly. "Maybe that's why they started calling them waste." Lena carefully folded her notebook shut and looked back at the mountains of discarded hardwood disappearing into the evening snowfall. "Then let's give them another chance," she said. Nathan nodded. For the first time in years, the old smokehouse filled the valley with a warm fragrance that drifted gently through the frozen pines, carrying with it the quiet promise that forgotten things and forgotten people could still begin again. 3 days after the first successful smokehouse trial, another powerful snowstorm swept across the Adirondack Mountains. By dawn, Nathan Cole's workshop had nearly disappeared beneath thick drifts, while fierce winds rattled every loose board on the old mill like distant drums. Most people stayed indoors. Nathan never could. Storms had a way of revealing things fair weather kept hidden. He spent the morning moving carefully selected hardwood into a covered shed before the moisture could damage it. Lena Brooks worked beside him without complaint, her green work jacket dusted white with snow. The two had settled into an easy rhythm. Nathan trusted her judgment on timber, while Lena admired the quiet patience that allowed him to see value where others saw failure. They spoke little, yet every hour together strengthened a partnership neither had expected to find. Late in the afternoon, an unexpected visitor wandered into the yard. It was an old Labrador retriever. The dog was large, but noticeably thinner than he should have been. His once golden coat had faded almost to silver around his face, and deep scars crossed one shoulder beneath the winter fur. His cloudy brown eyes carried the calm dignity of an animal that had worked hard all its life. One ear folded permanently to the side, evidence of an old injury that had healed long ago. A faded leather collar remained around his neck, though no identification tag survived. The old Labrador stopped several yards from Nathan and simply watched him. Nathan crouched slowly. "Well, you've seen a few winters yourself." The dog wagged his tail once. Not nervously, almost politely. Lena smiled. "I've seen him around town before. People say he belonged to one of the mill mechanics. After the shutdown, nobody ever came back for him." Nathan reached into his lunchbox and offered half a smoked beef sandwich. The Labrador accepted it gently, without snapping or begging. After eating, he stayed. "He looks like a Rusty," Nathan said. The dog lifted his head at the sound. "I guess that settles it." From that afternoon forward, Rusty refused to leave the workshop. As evening approached, the blizzard intensified. Nathan and Lena began clearing one of the oldest storage buildings behind the mill, hoping to salvage several stacks of hardwood before the roof collapsed beneath fresh snow. Years of abandoned sawdust had hardened into dense layers across the cracked concrete floor. Rusty suddenly stopped. His ears lifted. Without barking, he walked toward the darkest corner of the building and began scratching steadily at the packed sawdust. Unlike an excited pet chasing a scent, every movement appeared deliberate, almost purposeful. Nathan leaned on his shovel and watched. "Find something." Rusty continued digging. Lena stepped closer. "That's strange." Nathan walked across the room and pushed his shovel beneath the hardened layer. Instead of loose concrete, the blade struck solid metal with a deep hollow clang that echoed through the empty warehouse. Both of them froze. Nathan scraped away more debris until the outline of a heavy circular steel hatch slowly appeared beneath decades of compacted sawdust. Thick rust covered its surface, but the hinges remained surprisingly intact. Lena brushed snow from her gloves and stared at it. "I worked here for 9 years." She shook her head slowly. "I never knew this existed." Nathan rested one weathered hand on the cold steel. Whatever lay beneath had remained hidden far longer than either of them had imagined. Outside, the winter wind howled through the abandoned mill. Inside, the silence suddenly felt much louder. Nathan wedged the edge of his steel pry bar beneath the rusted hatch, while Lena steadied the opposite side. Years of frozen dust and corrosion resisted at first. Then, with a long groan that echoed through the abandoned warehouse, the heavy lid finally shifted. A wave of cold, dry air escaped from below, carrying the unmistakable scent of seasoned hardwood rather than mold. Nathan switched on an old battery lantern and directed its beam into the darkness. A narrow iron staircase disappeared beneath the mill. "It's not a bunker," Lena whispered. "It's too well built." They descended slowly. The walls were lined with old brick reinforced by thick timber beams that had survived decades underground. At the bottom, the passage opened into a long chamber unlike anything either of them expected. Instead of forgotten machinery, they found rows of carefully constructed drying racks. Dust covered every surface, but the room itself remained remarkably dry. Nathan knelt beside one stack and brushed away years of gray powder. Underneath rested beautifully preserved black walnut boards with rich chocolate grain that shimmered beneath the lantern light. "They've been drying naturally all this time," he murmured. Lena ran her fingertips across another board. No warping, no rot. This is extraordinary. Further inside the chamber stood dozens of wooden shelves filled with neatly labeled sample blocks. Small brass tags identified species from across the Northeast: black cherry, sugar maple, white oak, hickory, apple, beech, ash, and several rare hardwoods Nathan had only seen in museums or private collections. In one corner, they discovered an old drafting table. Leather-bound notebooks rested neatly inside a cabinet that had somehow escaped moisture. Nathan opened the first volume carefully. The pages contained hand-drawn diagrams showing experimental smoke combinations, drying temperatures, moisture percentages, and handwritten observations from craftsmen who had worked at the mill decades before it became a mass-production factory. This wasn't hidden because it was worthless, Nathan said quietly. It was someone's life's work. Lena nodded. When the company modernized, everything became about speed and volume. Knowledge like this probably wasn't considered profitable anymore. Nathan closed the notebook gently. His father had often said that every generation inherited more wisdom than it realized. Looking around the chamber, Nathan suddenly understood what Amos Cole had meant. Someone had preserved decades of craftsmanship beneath the very building everyone believed had been stripped of value. As they prepared to leave, Rusty walked toward the far end of the chamber and stopped beside an old steel cabinet that had fallen against the wall. He pawed it once, then looked back at Nathan. Nathan smiled. "You've got another idea, old friend?" Together, he and Lena lifted the cabinet just enough to reveal a narrow recess hidden behind it. Inside rested a small oak chest no larger than a toolbox. Unlike everything else, it carried no company markings, only a hand-carved emblem of a pine tree enclosed within a circle. Nathan did not open it. Something about the careful craftsmanship told him it deserved patience rather than curiosity. He carried the chest upstairs as snow continued falling outside the broken warehouse windows. Standing beneath the fading evening light, Nathan looked back toward the abandoned mill. A week earlier, he believed he had rescued forgotten wood. Now he realized the wood had quietly led him toward a forgotten legacy that someone had tried very hard to leave buried beneath the silence. The first clear Saturday after the storm arrived with brilliant blue skies stretching above the Adirondack Mountains. Fresh snow reflected the morning sun like polished crystal, and the streets of Saranac Lake slowly filled with neighbors eager to enjoy the first calm weekend in weeks. Smoke drifted gently from Nathan Cole's workshop, carrying a sweet aroma that seemed to follow the cold wind through the valley. Nathan stood before a long wooden workbench, carefully arranging small cloth bags filled with handcrafted smoking wood blends. Beside them rested several smoked beef briskets, thick-cut bacon, and maple-cured trout prepared over the previous week. Every package carried a simple, burned wood emblem of a pine tree, the same symbol carved onto the mysterious oak chest hidden beneath the abandoned mill. Nathan had copied it by hand, not as a brand, but as a quiet tribute to the forgotten craftsman whose notebooks had inspired him. Lena Brooks studied the display with folded arms. Her practical mind naturally searched for flaws before possibilities. "You know you'll sell out if people like it." Nathan chuckled while tightening the last piece of twine around a bundle of applewood. "I'm more worried about nobody stopping. You've spent 40 years learning your craft. I've spent 7 years forgetting it." Lena looked at him for a long moment. "Then today isn't about selling. It's about remembering." Nathan smiled. "I think you're right." An hour later, the small farmer's market beside Lake Flower buzzed with conversation. Local maple syrup producers, cheesemakers, beekeepers, and winter vegetable growers greeted familiar faces while children laughed around steaming cocoa stands. Nathan quietly unfolded the same scarred wooden table his father had built decades earlier. Unlike polished commercial booths, his display looked almost old-fashioned, yet it carried a warmth that drew curious eyes. The first visitor paused without speaking. His name was Benjamin "Ben" Foster, a 58-year-old owner of a family-run barbecue restaurant nearly 60 miles away in Lake Placid. Ben stood well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders softened by age, a neatly trimmed white beard, and kind hazel eyes that revealed years spent listening more than talking. Deep wrinkles surrounded his smile, earned from decades standing beside smokers rather than behind office desks. After surviving a serious heart attack 5 years earlier, Ben had sold 2 restaurants and kept only the smallest one, deciding he cared more about serving honest food than chasing endless expansion. He picked up a small piece of cherry smoking wood and rubbed it gently between his fingers before lifting it to his nose. "This wasn't kiln-dried," he said. Nathan nodded. "Air-aged." Ben smiled immediately. "I can tell." Nathan sliced a thin piece of smoked brisket and handed it across the table. Ben chewed slowly. The market seemed to disappear around him. First came the clean sweetness of applewood, followed by the richer fruit notes of black cherry, and finally a gentle hint of maple that lingered without overpowering the meat itself. The flavors blended naturally instead of competing. Ben lowered the sample. "I've judged barbecue competitions for 12 years. Nathan waited silently. "I've tasted wood from every corner of this country." Another bite. "This doesn't taste like smoke." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "It tastes," Ben continued softly, "like the forest remembered what it wanted to become." For several seconds neither man spoke. Ben reached into his coat pocket and removed a worn leather business card. "I don't make promises quickly." He placed the card on the table. "But I'd like to come see your workshop." Nathan looked down at the card, then toward Lena. She smiled quietly. It wasn't a purchase that mattered most. For the first time since Claire's passing, someone respected Nathan not for what he had accomplished years ago, but for what he was creating now. As more visitors slowly gathered around the small wooden table, the fragrance drifting from Nathan's smoked meats seemed to carry something larger than food across the winter air. It carried hope back into a workshop that had once believed its best days were already behind it. By midday, Nathan's small table no longer looked like the quiet corner he had arranged before sunrise. Every package of handcrafted smoking wood had found a buyer, and the smoked brisket disappeared so quickly that the cutting board sat empty except for a few scattered crumbs. People lingered even after purchasing, asking questions about wood species, aging methods, and why his products carried such an unusually balanced aroma. Nathan answered every question patiently, never sounding like a salesman. He spoke the way craftsmen always had, sharing knowledge before expecting trust. Lena stood several feet away, quietly observing the crowd. For years, she had watched customers rush through the old mill's warehouse, searching only for quantity and discounts. Today she witnessed something entirely different. People were willing to wait simply to hear Nathan explain why applewood softened the sweetness of maple, or why black cherry created a deeper finish without overpowering delicate meat. They were not buying wood alone. They were buying a story. Late that afternoon, another unfamiliar visitor approached the table. Her name was Evelyn Hart. At 46, Evelyn carried herself with calm confidence that came from decades of careful observation rather than loud authority. She was tall and slender with shoulder-length silver blonde hair tucked beneath a navy wool beret. Her pale blue eyes seemed to study details most people overlooked, while faint freckles across her fair complexion hinted at years spent outdoors despite her elegant appearance. She wore a long charcoal overcoat over practical hiking boots, an unusual combination that perfectly reflected her personality. Before becoming editor of Adirondack Heritage Journal, she had spent nearly 20 years documenting disappearing rural traditions throughout the Northeast. Watching historic crafts vanish one workshop at a time had left her determined to preserve the stories before they disappeared forever. She picked up one of Nathan's small smoking wood bundles and examined the burned pine tree emblem. "That's not a commercial logo," she said. Nathan smiled. "No. What does it mean?" "I don't completely know yet." For the first time all afternoon, Nathan briefly spoke about the forgotten drying chamber beneath the abandoned mill and the notebooks left behind by craftsmen whose names had almost vanished from memory. He carefully avoided mentioning the unopened oak chest, feeling that some discoveries deserved silence until their purpose became clear. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When Nathan finished, she closed her notebook slowly. "I came here because someone told me an old carpenter was selling exceptional smoked meat." She looked around the crowded market. "I think I've actually found a story about preserving American craftsmanship." Nathan laughed quietly. "I was only trying to save some discarded wood." "Sometimes," Evelyn replied, "history survives because one person refuses to throw something away." Before leaving, she requested permission to visit Nathan's workshop later that week. As the winter sun slipped behind the snow-covered Adirondack peaks, Nathan and Lena packed their nearly empty crates into the old pickup truck. Neither of them spoke during the drive home. Words seemed unnecessary. When they reached the workshop, Rusty greeted them at the gate, his tail wagging steadily despite his stiff joints. The old Labrador led them toward the smokehouse before lying peacefully beside the warm brick wall. Nathan looked across the quiet yard. Only a month earlier, the abandoned mill had represented failure. Now strangers were traveling miles to experience work created from materials everyone else had abandoned. He unlocked the workshop door, glanced once toward the oak chest resting safely on the highest shelf, and felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. For years he had believed he was rebuilding a business. Standing there beneath the fading winter light, Nathan finally understood he was rebuilding something far more valuable. He was rebuilding belief, his own, and perhaps that of an entire community that had forgotten the worth of patient hands. A full year had passed since the first bundle of forgotten hardwood was carried out of the abandoned mill. Winter returned to the Adirondack Mountains with the same relentless snow, yet everything around Nathan Cole's workshop had changed. What had once been a quiet property surrounded by forgotten timber had become a place where delivery trucks arrived before sunrise and visitors traveled from neighboring states simply to learn why his smoking would produce flavors they could not duplicate elsewhere. The old workshop still looked humble from the outside, but inside it pulsed with steady purpose. Every shelf was organized by species, every bundle carefully labeled by hand, and every piece of wood received the same patience Nathan believed every tree deserved. Nathan himself had changed as well. The deep sadness that had settled into his eyes after Claire's passing had softened into quiet confidence. His thick gray beard had grown slightly longer, and new lines marked the corners of his face, not from grief, but from smiling more often than he had in years. Success had not made him louder. It had only reminded him who he had always been before loss convinced him otherwise. Lena Brooks had become the heartbeat of the growing workshop. Her notebooks had evolved into a complete catalog of every drying batch, every wood blend, and every customer request. Though only 32, she carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had earned respect rather than demanded it. She moved through the workshop greeting every craftsman by name, checking moisture readings, inspecting storage racks, and reminding new apprentices that quality could never be rushed. Nathan often joked that while he still spoke to the wood, Lena spoke to the future. The forgotten oak chest remained unopened on the highest shelf. Not because Nathan feared what might be inside, because he believed certain things revealed themselves only after people had become worthy of understanding them. One snowy afternoon, a dark green SUV rolled quietly into the yard. A tall gentleman stepped out carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. He introduced himself as William Harper, 63 years old, chairman of the American Guild of Smoke and Fire Crafts, an organization devoted to preserving traditional wood-smoking techniques across the United States. William possessed the calm dignity of an old university professor. He stood nearly 6'2", with neatly combed silver hair, thoughtful gray eyes behind thin spectacles, and a well-kept white beard framing a narrow face weathered by decades of traveling from one rural workshop to another. Years earlier, he had lost his family's historic smokehouse to a wildfire in California, an event that transformed him from businessman into preservationist. Since then, he had dedicated his life to documenting disappearing craftsmanship before modern industry erased it forever. "I've spent 6 months hearing your name," William said warmly as he accepted Nathan's handshake. "I was beginning to think people exaggerated." Nathan smiled. "I hope they didn't." William laughed softly. "They underestimated." For the next several hours, Nathan guided him through every corner of the workshop. He explained why applewood should never be dried beside hickory, how mountain humidity influenced burning temperatures, and why every bundle rested naturally for months instead of being rushed through industrial kills. William listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions rather than offering opinions. He watched Nathan demonstrate subtle differences in aroma by shaving tiny curls from 3 nearly identical pieces of cherry wood. Finally, William closed his notebook. "What you've built here isn't simply a business." Nathan remained silent. "It's a school." Outside, Rusty made his familiar morning patrol despite the fresh snow covering the yard. Age had slowed his steps even further, and patches of white now covered almost every strand of golden fur around his face. Yet he still paused beside each stack of hardwood, as if personally inspecting the day's work before returning to rest beside the workshop door. Nathan watched the old Labrador through the frosted window. A year ago, Rusty had wandered into the abandoned mill looking for shelter. Now, without anyone planning it, he had become the quiet guardian of a place where forgotten things were given another chance. Nathan could not help smiling. Some legacies, he realized, were built by hands. Others arrived on 4 faithful paws. Chapter 5. The Legacy They Could No Longer Ignore, Part 2. Spring arrived slowly across the Adirondack Mountains, but the last traces of winter still lingered beneath the tall pines surrounding Nathan Cole's workshop. The snow had begun melting into clear streams that wound quietly through the forest, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh wood. Every morning, before the first employees arrived, Nathan walked the property with Rusty at his side. The old Labrador moved more slowly now, his joints stiff from age, yet he insisted on visiting every drying rack and every stack of hardwood before settling beside the smokehouse. Nathan never hurried him. Some journeys deserve to be taken at their own pace. A week after William Harper's visit, a handwritten letter arrived bearing the seal of the American Guild of Smoke and Fire Crafts. Nathan unfolded it carefully at the old oak table where he and Lena had once planned how to save a mountain of discarded wood. The Guild had unanimously voted to recognize Adirondack Smoke Works as a National Heritage Craft Workshop, the first small family operation in New York to receive the honor in more than 20 years. The recognition was not based on sales or popularity. It celebrated the preservation of forgotten knowledge, responsible use of natural resources, and craftsmanship passed from one generation to the next. Nathan looked toward Lena. "We didn't build this alone." She smiled. "We never did." Over the following months, something unexpected happened. Young apprentices began arriving from across the country, not because they wanted jobs, but because they wanted teachers. Former carpenters, culinary students, forestry graduates, and even veterans searching for a fresh beginning gathered inside the workshop. Nathan refused to call them employees. Instead, every morning began around a long wooden table where everyone shared breakfast before touching a single piece of wood. "If you don't respect the people beside you," Nathan often said, "you'll never respect the tree in your hands." One autumn afternoon, Evelyn Hart returned carrying the first printed issue of Adirondack Heritage Journal featuring Nathan's story on its cover. The headline read, "The Workshop That Taught America to Listen Again." Inside, Evelyn wrote not about business success, but about patience, humility, and the forgotten dignity of craftsmanship. The article spread far beyond the Adirondacks. Visitors continued arriving, not to witness a miracle, but to understand how ordinary people had created something extraordinary simply by refusing to waste what others ignored. Late that winter, Nathan finally carried the small oak chest from its shelf and placed it on the workbench where Claire had once helped wrap smoked meats for local fairs. Lena stood quietly beside him while Rusty rested near the warm brick smokehouse, his breathing slower than it had ever been. Nathan gently opened the lid. Inside lay no fortune, no legal documents, and no hidden deed. Instead, there rested a collection of hand-carved wooden measuring tools, a small compass worn smooth by decades of use, and a folded letter written by the master craftsman who had supervised the old drying house generations earlier. Nathan unfolded the fragile paper. The final lines read, "Wood remembers every season it survives. People are no different. If these tools ever reach your hands, do not ask how much they are worth. Ask instead whether you are willing to become worthy of using them." Nathan folded the letter with trembling hands. He realized the greatest treasure hidden beneath the abandoned mill had never been the wood itself. It was the wisdom left behind by people who believed that true craftsmanship should outlive those who created it. As another gentle snowfall drifted across the workshop yard, Rusty slowly rose and completed one final quiet walk around the stacked hardwood before returning to lie peacefully beside Nathan's boots. Nathan rested one weathered hand on the old Labrador's head and looked across the bustling workshop where laughter, hammer blows, and the scent of sweet hardwood filled the crisp mountain air. One forgotten pile of discarded timber had become a place where hope was built every single day. And Nathan understood, with complete certainty, that the richest inheritance anyone could leave behind was never money or land. It was the willingness to see value where everyone else had already stopped looking. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder, lightning, or voices from heaven. Sometimes, they begin with something the world has already given up on. A forgotten piece of wood, an abandoned workshop, an old dog that refuses to stop believing, or a weary heart that finds the courage to hope one more time. Nathan believed he was rescuing discarded timber, but perhaps God was using that forgotten wood to rescue Nathan instead. Because God often hides extraordinary blessings inside ordinary things, waiting for someone with faith, patience, and compassion to discover them. The same is true in our everyday lives. There may be someone around you who feels forgotten, someone who has been told they are no longer useful, someone carrying silent pain behind a smile. Sometimes, one kind word, one helping hand, or one person willing to see their true value can completely change the course of a life. Maybe today, God is inviting you to become that person. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who could use a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, because we'd love to know where our friends are joining us from around the world. And if you believe that faith, kindness, and second chances still have the power to change lives, please subscribe to the channel and become part of our growing family. May God bless you, your home, your loved ones, and everyone who is still willing to see beauty where the world only sees waste. We'll see you again in the next story.